You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is kindly sponsored by XDEEP, world leader in sidemount diving systems, and I'm very grateful for the support that XDEEP provides me with this podcast, which goes a huge way to making all of this possible. Well, it's been an amazing year, and in particular, really fulfilling last 3 months since I launched Speaking Sidemount. I obviously started this podcast thinking that there would be an audience hungry for the quality information on sidemount diving that we're providing, but I've been humbled and simply pumped with the support that I've received from all of you, but just as importantly from my amazing guests who have freely given their time to share with us on sidemount diving. I don't know about you, but personally I've learned so much from each discussion, and this has already made a profound effect both on my diving and on the way that I teach sidemount diving. Also this year, in addition to some amazing diving that I've done here in New Zealand, I was very fortunate to be able to go on a couple of brilliant dive trips. Firstly, to fulfill a lifelong dream to go to Truk Lagoon, and secondly, to Niue Island for my son's 21st birthday. Each of these had their own special moments, and I'll share with you via an episode on sidemount diving in each of these amazing locations. Now, I hope for obvious reasons, many of our podcast episodes have focused on sidemount cave diving and exploration. It's an amazing tool for this purpose. However, as I emphasized way back and was supported by many, including Steve Bogarts and Gary Dallas, sidemount is also a great tool for other overhead environments such as wreck diving. So I'm really pleased to be able to share with you today my experiences wreck diving sidemount at Truk Lagoon. Like almost all divers of my generation, I grew up glued to the TV screen every Sunday evening to watch the underwater world of Jacques Cousteau. I watched dreaming of being Albert Falco or Bernard Delamont and gliding through the water exploring the underwater deep. I remember vividly one episode where Captain Cousteau and the Calypso visited Truk Lagoon in what is now known as Chuuk in the Federated States of Micronesia. I think it must have been in the early 70s, and I still recall one of the Cousteau divers picking up the skull of a poor soul lost in the battles that were Operation Hailstone. Not really one of their finer moments, and something that would be frowned upon today to say the least. Nonetheless, the story of Operation Hailstone is eye-watering in every sense of the word. It occurred in 1944 as US forces swept across the South Pacific, retaking land lost to the Japanese in previous years. Truk Lagoon formed a natural harbour some 60 miles across and afforded the Japanese a number of secure anchorages from which they could resupply their forces in the southwestern Pacific. The lagoon was thought to be very secure and difficult, if not impossible, to attack. And while this was true for surface ships, this period of history saw the rise of the aircraft carrier as a dominant force with its ability to extend air power over large distances. And so the Americans planned their attack on the Japanese land, sea, and air assets using meticulous planning and intelligence gained from aerial photographs. The Japanese were expecting this attack, but not for some weeks later than the actual event. On February 17 and 18, 1944, the US Navy surprised the Japanese supply fleet and engaged them with 500 aircraft from nearby carriers. It was complete carnage, and the Japanese fleet was annihilated with over 60 ships and numerous aircraft sent to the bottom of the lagoon. The loss of life was tremendous, with literally hundreds of sailors perishing in many of the vessels that were sunk. And yet out of this tragedy of war has come arguably the wreck diving capital of the world. Truk Lagoon affords sheltered access to more than 60 wrecks and aircraft at depths ranging from near the surface to over 70 meters. Some 40 of the wrecks are accessible to recreational divers, and nearly all of them offer technical dives, be it related to depth or penetration opportunities. With Jacques Cousteau's recording of the wrecks of Truk Lagoon, divers from around the world began to visit Chuuk, and so its legend grew as successive divers shared their experiences of diving the wrecks. Right from my first realization of Truk, I knew that one day I would go there, and finally this year I was able to make that happen. I've known Kiwi wreck diver, CCR instructor and photographer Pete Mesley for a few years now, having met him through Global Dive in Auckland, with whom I partner on sidemount courses here in New Zealand. Pete's a great guy, a real diver's diver, and he also runs Lust for Rust, one of the very best tech diving trip operators going. Peter's built a fantastic dive excursion business by specializing in trips to some of the world's signature wreck diving locations, including Chuuk, Guadalcanal, Bikini Atoll, and the Great Lakes. His reputation is built on meticulous planning and service, catering to every need of his tech diving customers while ensuring safety, including having a hyperbaric diver physician on every trip. And so I booked to join many of my global dive friends and colleagues on the June 2018 trip to Truk. My recollection thinking back now on this trip was I was literally counting the seconds for nearly a year leading up to it, and as the months got closer and closer, I started thinking about planning. How would I dive Sidemount and Truk? And thankfully, when I first engaged with Pete about going on the trip, the first thing he said is, hey, what do you need? So I said, hey, listen, modular valves would be my first requirement. And so Pete came to the party, he ordered 15 sets of modular valves just straight off the bat so that he could support Sidemount divers on his trip. As I thought more about what it might take to dive 4 aluminium cylinders in Sidemount, the first thing that comes to mind is the amount of mass or weight that you have at the front of your body. So you've got your regulators, first stages, you've also got the valves. And so what tends to happen in Sidemount is that you become very head down. And so it's quite difficult to get enough weight low in your system such that you can compensate for that. And that's particularly the case if you're diving, as we were, in 3mm wetsuits, because the water temperature was 30 Celsius. So we're in very, very warm tropical water. So what I decided to do, I'd seen Thomas Michur, his Dual Bladder system, where he was using the XDEEP Stealth 2.0 tech harness as his main harness, but was also using the classic bladder as a trimming bladder across his shoulders. And I thought that was a brilliant idea in terms of being able to manage this particular problem. And so I tested it. I fitted the classic bladder across my shoulders, inverted it, set it up, and practiced out of the water for quite a few days to make sure that I was very comfortable on how I would use that. And I'll cover that a little more later on in terms of exactly how I made that work in the water. Now, of course, the next thing is, as we got closer, we're starting to think about travel. And my background, I think some of you know, I used to be an executive for a software company. And so I did a lot of travel, and I had what was known as Gold Elite status with Air New Zealand, which was terrific. So it means you get lounge access and preferential treatment. And also, most importantly, for diving, you get extra baggage. And so I didn't have that this time. I'd lost all of my status over the past few years. And so I was back to one 23-kilo bag to fly all the way from Auckland through Tokyo and on to Guam and then Truk Lagoon. And I thought about buying an extra bag, and I thought, no, Sidemount, I should be able to do this with one bag. It's one of the great advantages is how light we can travel. So I set myself up. I got all of my dive gear into one 23-kilo bag, all of my clothes, what there was of them, a few pairs of shorts, underwear, and singlets, and flip-flops, or jandals as we call them, into my carry-on, along with my regulators, and I was away to go. So that worked out great. It was right on the nose, though, 23 kilos exactly, but that worked out great for me. Next thing thinking about travel is, especially flying from Auckland, New Zealand, but pretty much from anywhere in the world, it's brutal to get to Truk. You've got to fly into one of the Asian hubs. So for us, it was Narita in Tokyo, so we had a direct flight there, some 10 hours or so. And then we had to turn around and fly back pretty much on the same path to Guam. We had a 6-hour layover there, which was just brutal. And then we had our final flight to Truk. So I guess we eventually made it, but the flights and layovers are certainly kind of difficult and challenging in terms of travel. Once we arrived in Chuuk in the Federated States of Micronesia, it's fairly typical for a remote location, so relatively rudimentary airport and check through immigration and so on, but that was all fine. We got ourselves through. Pete met us on arrival, and then we had a pretty bouncy bus trip across the local roads to get to our resort, which is Blue Lagoon Resort. I was quite impressed with it, to be honest. I mean, it's a solid 2-star, and you could say it's in need of a refurb in terms of the buildings, but the things that are important to divers, and I mean, we had clean beds, they were clean and comfortable, the air conditioning worked, we got some hot water, it was a bit sporadic, but it was 30 degrees Celsius outside, so hey, who cares? They delivered fresh water to us for drinking. So everything that I think we needed was taken care of in terms of our rooms. In terms of other aspects of the resort, the food was just excellent. I mean, we had a really, really large range. They had a pretty big menu there, to be honest, but the food was really good for where we are. The staff really go out of their way to look after you. Typically, they are brought on as dive groups come in, so they're very appreciative of the work that they're receiving, and they understand completely that our satisfaction goes a long way to wanting to come back. So they're extremely attentive, and I really enjoyed the service that we got there. The dive shop itself was absolutely excellent. Pete's put a lot of work into helping them set up for tech divers, but they've been in operation for a long time now. So the things I enjoyed most on arrival there was each of us had our own station. So we were able to set our gear up, and we had that station for the duration of our visit, which meant that, you know, you had your place. It was really important for the CCR guys, I have to say, but I enjoyed it for myself as well. Now, in terms of the location itself and briefings, Pete gave us an on-arrival briefing where he covered some of the history of Truk, which I covered earlier, and then talked a little bit about how the whole period that we were there would run. And the way typically things worked is each day we'd get a briefing, and we'd brief for the 2 dives that we would do. Potentially that day you could do 1 or 2. Each day there was a whiteboard which showed you which maru or which vessel you were going to be diving on, and you could request anything. So if there was a particular vessel that you wanted to dive, then you could do that. I think that was excellent. In the beginning, you didn't really know where you were going, and then as the trip went on and you talked to other divers, you got to know which ships might be the ones that you really wanted to dive. Absolutely amazing facilities in terms of gases. There's full trimix, nitrox. Helium is very expensive, so that's something to consider. Obviously, that favors the CCR divers a little bit, but I wasn't really suffering, and I'll cover that a little bit more later on in terms of bills and so on, but I didn't suffer too much by diving air on a lot of the dives and then choosing trimix where I felt it was necessary. Each day we'd turn up, and on the first day I had a little bit of setup to do for Sidemount. I had to set my cylinders up and put the bands on and so on, which took some time, and there was a fair amount of jokes going back and forward between the back mount divers, myself, and the CCR divers. But in the end, I think let's just say I think I got a points victory on that one. First day took me a little time, and from then on I'd turn up about half an hour after the CCR guys, test my cylinders and load everything on the boat, and that was it. So it was a really, really simple and easy process. Again, the dive crews are fantastic. They load the boat for you. Once they get to know you a little bit, they know, number one, where you want to be on the boat, how you like your cylinders laid out, and also exactly what you're going to be using in terms of gases. So they're almost mind reading, and I thought they were outstanding. The other thing with the crew is they were just absolutely outstanding at finding dive sites. So each of the sites is marked, however the buoys or buoys that mark the sites are about 2 meters under the surface. And they do that, I think, so that others can't find the site. So they are able to navigate out there without use of GPS or anything else, just simply by looking at the islands and using, I guess, the techniques that they've used over many millennia to be able to find these sites. So I thought they were brilliant in that respect. Most of the dive sites are really close to home base, so there was really not very many of them that were more than 10-15 minute boat ride out, a couple of 20, and then if you go out to the Oiti destroyer, then that's going to take a little longer. But the vast majority of them were very, very close, 10-15 minute boat ride out. I mentioned how the crew were great at finding the dive sites. Now, the first thing again, after loading the boat, was thinking about entries and exits. The crew, again, are extremely supportive for Sidemount diving. So for entries and exits, if you want to don in the water, you could certainly do that. They were great at handing cylinders to you. But equally, you could don on the boat. And I tended to don on the boat, not because it was the easiest way. I think I would have preferred to don in the water. But the crew were also pretty busy helping the CCR guys out with putting on their bailouts and so on. So while they were doing that, I thought, hey, I might as well just put my cylinders on and fall into the water in as most elegant fashion as I possibly could. I mentioned earlier that I was using the Michur Dual Bladder system, so I'd have in fact I used the XDEEP Stealth recreational harness on this trip. I usually use the Tech one here in New Zealand, mainly because I didn't think that I would need any more lift than the recreational harness provides. So I had the recreational harness and BCD along with a classic across my shoulders in that dual bladder configuration. I did have power inflators on both. Diving that, what I did is I used the recreational bladder for buoyancy compensation as we reached depth, and I'd use that for the entire dive until we reached the ascent point. And then as we started to ascend, and in particular as we started to use some gas from the decompression cylinders during deco stops and so on, I was able to just put a couple of puffs into the classic bladder to bring my head up and then perhaps dump a little out of the back of the recreational bladder. And so by doing that between the two bladders, I was able to be absolutely 100% in trim, even though I had all of this weight forward. It was a really, really nice experience, and I was so comfortable doing this. So, honestly, I could have fallen asleep. And I was only carrying 3 kilos of weight, so it would have been really difficult to keep myself in trim just using weight alone. So I was very, very pleased with how that worked out, and extremely comfortable during, I think, one of the most important times when you want to be comfortable, which is during your ascent and decompression. In terms of the dives themselves, I mean, it's 30-degree water. It was extremely comfortable. The visibility was down a little on our trip. It rained most days, as it is wont to do in the tropics. However, I found the visibility really, really good. And so on our worst days, it was around 10 meters. And on our better days, we got up to 30, 35 meters. And so that was amazing. As we started out on the trip, we were diving some of the shallower wrecks. So we were doing dives in the 20 to 35 meter range. But as we started to hit our straps on the trip, we moved on to some of the deeper wrecks. So the San Francisco Maru was one that really stands out to me. And so we really had the option of starting to dive trimix on those. I did do a couple of deep air dives, which is not something that I would normally do. But again, looking at the environment that we were in, it was warm water, great visibility. So we did that. One thing that is important is decompression planning and making sure that you're looking after yourself in terms of multi-day diving where you're doing decompression dives. And thankfully, I've got a fair bit of experience in this from my time at Gozo Technical, where often I'd be guiding technical dives. However, one thing in Truk, and Pete really emphasized this with us, is that every year, there's some bends cases that occur at Truk Lagoon because of the nature of the diving. So we really thought really hard about it, and Pete's implemented some new rules which I think went a long way to improving safety on our trip. First one was that there was a 4-hour surface interval between the first and second dive. So if you chose to do a second dive, you needed to be out of the water in sufficient time to allow for that 4-hour surface interval before you started the next dive. And then the other thing is we had a hard stop at 4:30. We had to be out of the water. So by doing that, it meant that if you had a long deep dive in the morning, you really had no opportunity to dive in the afternoon. So it kind of enforced a 1 dive day for deep long dives. And if you were going to do a second dive, it made sure that there was the 4-hour surface interval there to allow some additional off-gassing. Decompression can be a very personal thing, and what are you using? Most of us there were using Bullman and using gradient factors for that, and based on some of the advice of Dr. Simon Mitchell, we've changed our gradient factors to 40-70, so we've increased the GF low. The other thing that we did after discussions with Pete was we changed the way that we managed our decompression from 12 meters to the surface. So what we would do is we'd be following our computers or following our plan, but we'd clear our 12-meter stop and our 9-meter stop at 12. We'd then move to 9 meters and clear our 6. We'd then move to 6 and clear 3. And then 3 meters became our last stop. So what that meant was, when in reality, for the sort of dive profiles that we were doing, where we might be at 60, 65 meters for a 20-minute bottom time, was that the hour or so of decompression that we had in our planners was extended by 10 to 15 minutes. And in particular, we were spending extra time at 6 meters on 100% O2. So I think that was a really good idea and a really great way to manage decompression in the shallows. Obviously, others may have different opinions, but that seemed to work really, really well for us, and I was very pleased with the way we were able to manage that. Yeah, my bottom line on decompression is the more time you can spend at 6 meters on 100% O2 within reason, the better. The wrecks themselves were just absolutely amazing. Each boat had a guide, and so the dive guide would come in and give us a brief. Pete had already given us a brief back at the dive center, but we had another brief from them, and then they would guide us onto the wreck. And there would be specific points of interest on each wreck that they would take us to. And to be honest, in the beginning, there's a little bit of a tourist trail on each wreck where some artifacts are laid out. So this is great for recreational divers. You can look at the artifacts. There'll be plates and ammunition and so on. But after a while, we kind of had a chat to the guides and said, hey, we'd rather not do the tourist trail. Take us to the really good spots. And as they saw the level of experience we were as divers, they were happy to do that. So what would happen, we'd had a lot more gas than the guides. The guides have a single cylinder with a pony. They'd come down, they'd guide us to the spots of interest. They then would wave goodbye, start their ascents, and we'd continue with our dives, and usually we'd be in the water for another 30 minutes to an hour after they'd left. Most of our run times are around the 90-minute range. That's including our decompression. My favorites in terms of the wrecks, I mean, if you go to Truk Lagoon, you have to dive the San Francisco Maru. I just thought that was an absolutely amazing wreck. The decks are between 50 and 55 meters. It's got 2 amazing holds that you can go in where you can see mines and 250-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs. But then as you come back onto the deck, there's a brilliant bow and deck gun. There's tanks on the deck. It's just a brilliant dive. So that's really one. And we did it twice on this trip. I really want to go back and get to know that wreck a lot better. The other one that stuck out was Rio de Janeiro Maru. One of the better engine rooms. This ship lays on its side, and Pete's done a fantastic job of being able to light up the engine room. And so he goes in and places lights around it and then takes photographs. And so we were able to come in and be part of that and get our own pictures with it lit up the way Pete does it. So I thought that was brilliant. So that's another one. The Oiti Destroyer, a little deeper. This one sits in 65 meters of water. It's a super interesting wreck. The story of the Oiti was that it was returning into Truk Lagoon when the attack was actually happening. And once they saw the attack, they turned around and tried to escape. However, they were discovered by a torpedo bomber, and I think it also had another torpedo bomber or bomber which attacked the Oiti. It was carrying out evasive maneuvers, and during those maneuvers it was struck directly midships by a torpedo and blown completely in half. The loss of life on this one was just staggering, and they'd already picked up some survivors from another wreck. It was just catastrophic what happened. Now the resulting explosion, as I said, blew the ship in half, and what happened is the bow completely turned around and faces in the opposite direction to the stern. As I said, they sunk 65-70 meters of water, and the bow and the stern section are about 40 meters apart. We used scooters for this one. We took DPVs with us and scooted over to the bow and went round the bow, had a look inside. Where it's been hit, you can see straight into the machinery spaces, so you're looking straight into the engine room on the bow, and then of course you can go over to the stern and you're seeing the other half, and the other half has many, I think it's 4-inch guns on it. So it was just a really, really neat dive. So that's another one that I really want to go back to. Looking at some of the other wrecks, the thing that really struck me apart from the wrecks themselves was that just the beautiful soft and hard corals that have grown on the wrecks, that really has become an amazing habitat for, and there's a lot of fish on them as well, a little more than what I was expecting. So alongside all of the wreck artifacts, torpedoes, bombs, trucks, tanks, aircraft parts, just the marine life also was really, really interesting, and I enjoyed that a lot. One of the things I really enjoy is après diving. Anyone who knows me knows that's true, and this was a really good group. We were from all over the world. Our particular group had a lot of Kiwis or New Zealanders. We had Americans on there as well, and a few Europeans, and it was just brilliant. I really enjoyed that. We'd come back after diving all day. Usually we'd do a download of photographs or video, and then have a clean up, head into the bar at about 5, have a couple of drinks before dinner, and it was just a really, really good experience in terms of the people that I met of interest. I mentioned this in the interview that I did with Eric Brown, but I was very fortunate to meet Richard Harry Harris while I was there. I also met Lynn and Bruce Partridge from Shearwater Research, who do the best dive computers in my mind in the world. I had some great discussions with all of them, with Harry about CCR and about cave diving and Sidemount CCR, and with Lynn and Bruce we were talking about some of the great service stories that they have from their business, and I was lucky enough to be part of that with one of mine, where they helped me out with a defect on my computer before I was heading to Fiji. So great company, great service, and really neat to meet the people behind that. Overall, I was there for 12 days, 16 wrecks, more than 24 hours underwater, and just a brilliant, brilliant experience. If you're interested in seeing some of the dives that I did, if you pop over to the Sidemount Pros YouTube channel, there's 2 videos there. There's one that I kind of call the documentary, which is a 16-minute version, not necessarily for everyone's consumption. Some people don't have the attention span, but it was really a video record of each of the ships that we dived in succession, with a little bit of video footage so that I can remember for the next time I go back exactly what we did and what I want to do again. There's also a second video on there which is a little more Sidemount related, 3 minutes long, and it really just takes the highlights out of the other video. And so either one, if you want to have a look at those, please go and have a look. One thing that I do want to do in terms of Truk is I spoke to Pete And this is an ideal location for side mount diving. I talked a little bit earlier about wreck diving and how appropriate side mount is for wreck diving as well as cave diving. I was able to complete my dives there without suffering at all alongside the back mount divers or the CCR divers. Very benign in terms of currents and waves and so on in sheltered environments. So getting it in and out of the water isn't a problem. And that means side mount really comes to the fore in terms of our ability to execute dives. And the things that stand out, I mentioned the trim. Everyone else, and this is all of the back mount divers and CCR divers, struggle to maintain trim for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. You've got so much weight either forward or back, and it's difficult to move weight around to make compensation for out of balance forces in terms of your gear setup, especially in very light exposure protection. So number one, I was able to be in trim, and I was probably the only one who really did that as comfortably as I did. The other thing was that easy in and out of the water, easy to load. I didn't suffer in terms of dive times. Obviously the CCR guys had the capability to go longer, but not many of them did. So generally we'd be doing a very, very similar ascent profile with me using bottom gas and then a 50% nitrox and a 100% O2 as my two decompression gases. So that was fine. In terms of our bills at the end of the dive, I did 4 trimix dives, and the rest was on air, and my bill was very, very similar to the CCR diver bill when you look at the gas that they used. Even though much less, they also had a sorb bill, which somewhat compensated for the two. Now, in terms of going back, I just have to go back to Truk. It's just one of those things that, and Pete said this, he said you'll go there and then you'll just want to go back, and he's absolutely right. You just get a bug, and I've definitely got it. So I'm planning now to be heading back in 2020. One of the things I've spoken to Pete about is whether we could set up through Speaking Sidemount a side mount diver trip. He already has 15 sets of modular valves there ready to go for side mount divers, and I don't see any reason why we couldn't get a fantastic group of side mount divers together on this trip. Yeah, I think we'd have a great time. So we're going to start putting that together in 2019, and I'll start to announce some more details on it as one of the trips that we organise through Speaking Sidemount with Pete Mesley's Lust for Rust. So look out for more of that. Again, I've been really excited to share this with you. It was, for me, one of the trips of a lifetime. I've now got many more to do, and of course now I have to go back there, as I said, but it really made my year in terms of diving, and very pleased to have been able to share this with you. Again, I want to thank XDEEP for their sponsorship of the podcast. As I keep saying, this is really a labor of love for me, but it takes a mountain of time, and so having their support really helps to compensate for some of that. So thanks, Pieter, and also the team at XDEEP. I also want to thank everybody who's listened to Speaking Sidemount this year. This will be the last episode until after the Christmas break. I've got so much on with everything else, so we'll have another episode coming out early in the new year. I want to thank the people who have supported me in terms of being my guests as well. I already have some amazing guests lined up for January and into the new year. And of course, through our Facebook page, if there's anyone that you want to suggest, then I'm all ears. And if there's any episodes that you really want to hear, then I'll do my absolute best to bring that to you. Thanks very much. Happy holidays, happy Christmas, whatever it is that you celebrate. I hope you have a wonderful finish to 2018. I hope there's some diving in order. And let's catch up again in the new year for another episode of Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. Thanks very much. You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.